Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar. Unfortunately, still a webinar. It is the last act of the year for the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, where we're launching our fourth paper in the project that we have been undertaking for this last year, addressing carbon leakage in the EU, making Cbam work in a portfolio of measures. Since we have a very long name like ERCST, we can also afford a very long name and a very long title for the paper. Now, having said this, what I wanted to is to allow for a few minutes for people to stream in as it takes time, and invariably a few people are late. We have gotten used to a different dynamic. We don't see much at a meeting of people showing 5-10 minutes late, but we seem to get horribly irritated when people are 1 minute late for a meeting on a Zoom for some unknown reason. But take this opportunity to introduce all of the speakers for today. First of all, the initial presentation will be undertaken together with my colleagues Michael Mealing and Aaron Cosby and Alexandra Maratu, who are the authors of the paper that is available on the website. Again, together with the other papers that we have written in the series. And then we have the pleasure of having us a number of commentators, people that will comment, criticize the heck out of the paper. I'm sure of it, and still more power to them, because this is what a think tank should be for, to take, to have a critical discussion and honest critical discussion about ideas and a clash of ideas. That's what think tanks are for. So people that you all know, Oliver Sartor, Carsten Neuhoff, Peter Chase, and Marcos Gonzalez Alvarez join us from the European Commission today. So that's kind of the order in which we will do our things today. Would like to again wait a little bit more for a few more people to come in. Now, I think it's 14:03. I think at some point, but by 14:05 or so, we will start, and then move on. It's very difficult to motivate people before, a week before or 10 days before Christmas to still concentrate on CBAMs and ETS after they have been the whole year, sorry, Marcos, but the whole year they have been immersed in this stuff, that I think that everybody is kind of had their fill of climate change policy. But next year there's more to come. So, don't give up yet. Now, since we are at this point, I think it's time that we can start. Alexandra, do you want to do you put it? Do I put it? How do we do this? That we have agreed to many things, but we haven't agreed to this one. Do you want to put it up?
Either you or Derek. No.
Okay, let me put it. I think I have it open. Yeah, I have it open. So allow me to first of all do this. Hang on a second, and then do this, and then do this, and then do this, and hope I get the right thing on the screen, not something that will embarrass me. Okay, so there we go. The addressing carbon leakage in the EU, making Cbam work in a portfolio of measures. The first mistake is noted. It's Andre Marcu, Mike Mealing, Aaron Cosby, and Alexandra Maratu missing, but nevertheless not less important. I'll take responsibility for this, and apologies to Alexandra. So I would like to first, in terms of introduction, a few premises behind our paper is that current leakage measures, measures against protection, do not seem aligned with the EU decarbonization objective over the long to medium term. We see that's a euphemism for saying that we are getting into a situation where really free allocation is beginning to run its course mathematically as the curve, as the LRF accelerates. You're going to start running out of free allocation also. I think more and more is becoming quite clear that there's going to be less free allocation as a matter of principle. Even the fact that we have some very ambitious targets, we're also heading possibly into a stock take. I mean, we certainly going to stock take in 2023, one in 2028. And while don't have a crystal ball, I would be totally shocked if we end up with still 55% by the end of this. So this is going to get increasingly tight. And therefore, the CBAM is put forward to address this, to address carbon leakage and replace current safeguards. It will replace it, and this is what we're here for. Can it replace it on its own? Does it have to be, like when some guy retires, invariably Peter, we know this stuff, right? When some guy retires and you find out that you replace him with 2 or 3 people. This is a little bit like the free allocation. I think once we retire, then you're gonna need 2 or 3 people to deal with it. And this is what I think the case that we're making there. And this is our past research, because we've been working on this topic for a number of years now, has shown that CBAM is not a silver bullet, and neither it is a one size fits all. If you look at the paper that we did about 11 months ago, we dealt with sectoral deep dive, you'll find that not all sectors have the same characteristic and the same needs in terms of a potential CBAM. And there are certain accents or certain emphasis that needs to be put in different things. The current CBAM, when I said the current CBAM proposal, the way we see it, differs certain critical issues or leave them unaddressed. I think some of them, it reminds me of the Paris Agreement, which had a lot of constructing ambiguities that then led to 3 years of discussion for Article 6. But there are in the current proposal a number of unaddressed or ambiguities left in there. And not all of these can be addressed through the design of CBAM itself. Some of them can be both through CBAM design modifications to the proposal, as well as other potentially complementary issues. So seeing CBAM as a part of the strategic portfolio can help us. I think that it is one way that we think we can achieve the objectives. The objectives of the CBAM, we will not get into this, but in principle, it is dealing with carbon leakage. Now, this may not be popular, it may not be WTO-ish, but the reality is that nobody wakes up in the morning and decide to carbon leak. I mean, people wake up in the morning and say, what shall I do? What shall I do to survive? And they find out that they are in a completely competitive world. And as such, this may lead to carbon leakage at some point. The paper that we launched today is about looking at this complementary issue. It focuses less on the CBAM itself. I think this is important. It's not that we are not aware of it. There are different solutions that may be applied to the CBAM, but it really focuses on the suite of measures that can potentially accompany the CBAM and address certain gaps. So I will stop here and pass it on. Michael, is you now or Aaron? Sorry, I'm losing track now.
Happy to do this one. Andre mentioned the idea of the paper is not to look so much at how to improve the CBAM design. We'd already, of course, discussed that in several previous reports, including our sort of strawman proposal, if you like, before the actual proposal was launched in July, but really look at how the current proposal released in mid-July can be implemented in a way as part of a portfolio of measures that address certain issues, certain gaps, certain challenges, as Andre mentioned. The suite of policies that we focus on, and it's not exhaustive, of course, you can always think of additional policies in the report. We even mention a few additional things that could be explored, but these are the the 8 main sort of complementary, in some cases even alternative policies. One could think of them as alternatives as well. And I'll just go very briefly through them. You'll recognize from the color coding that we've tried to apply a similar approach that you might be familiar with from our previous reports, where we look at a set of criteria: environmental benefits, competitiveness benefits, then sort of the technical administrative feasibility, the legal feasibility, and the likelihood of political or diplomatic complications, pushback, etc. And assign a value to that. And I have to add also that we're looking in this case at the policies in isolation, if you like, coupled with the CBAM, not in combination with other policies, because some of these policies, like consumption-based approaches, do of course propose to be combined with, say, free allocation and the EU ETS as a continued approach. And so that would affect the evaluation. But let me first go through quickly this list. So the first one is, of course, let's say the first best approach to dealing with the symmetries of climate policy effort and related costs around the globe would be to get more convergence on climate policy effort through diplomatic means, through cooperation, and so on and so forth. Of course, we know we can't get there overnight, but this is definitely an important option that has to be pursued. Exemptions and rebates. This is what we consider sort of reducing the carbon cost facing compliance entities upfront from the outset. Free allocation is an example. It just reduces the burden that they face from the outset, ex ante, if you like. The next category of credits and compensations, they face a burden, they face a cost, but it will be credited or compensated some way retroactively. Indirect carbon cost compensation is an example of that, but again, there's different ways that this category can be implemented. Then excise charges or climate contributions, as they're often named. We've perhaps wrongly called it consumption charges because we used that term in the past, but it's perhaps more accurately described as using pricing as on consumption, a consumption-based approach to pricing. Here, a nod to Carsten, who's on the panel, and I'm sure will also relate to that or explain that further. Product requirements, we use the word requirements. Some say standards, but in the technical barriers to trade agreement, standards is a technical term for voluntary standards. So we call it product requirements, essentially requiring certain characteristics, certain attributes of products related to the carbon intensive production. Carbon contracts for difference, again, an instrument that we already analyzed in our first report, I think, out of this project. So very targeted monetary support in a competitive process for specific pilot projects to bring ultra low carbon industrial production to market, scale it up, etc. Similarly, research, development, and demonstration, there's some overlap between those two, but it's a different, the more traditional approach to sort of ensuring that you get this technology cost and the learning curve, etc., and scale up the production processes, bring down the cost. And finally, government procurement as another powerful tool for governments, again, with certain limitations, but to accelerate sort of deployment of low carbon and ultra low carbon basic materials and other industrial goods. And I think we can move to the next slide and look how we propose using these complementary measures in the context of a set of gaps or challenges that we've identified left by the current proposal that the European Commission released in July. The first one, and perhaps one of the most discussed, is of course that this proposal does not address leakage that might occur for European products exported and sold in global markets. And there's been a lot of discussion with very, very different views about that. So first of all, the proposal as it stands currently only applies European carbon pricing, so the EUA price, to imports. European products that leave the market, they're still faced with the cost of the EU ETS, but they will not benefit from the CBAM in those third markets. And there is an environmental dimension to that, and there's a lot of discussion how real this challenge is, how real this threat. But if and the data suggests that this is not inaccurate, we can assume that most of the covered products are on average produced with less carbon intensive means, again, on average in the EU compared to the global carbon intensity average, then having substitution of European products with or through foreign products in global markets could lead to a net increase of emissions around the globe. And this can also have implications for competitiveness in the domestic market, given that many of these value chains for both products produced for the domestic market and for foreign markets will be equally affected. We've had compelling descriptions of how this could happen, for instance, for refiners, that this also really affects the domestic production. And so the question is, how can one potentially deal with this? As I said, there's discussion about the reality of the leakage challenge and whether or not it is an environmental problem. Our discussions with a number of stakeholders suggest that it is, but I think this discussion has to, of course, also be, the data has to be analyzed, the discussion has to be carried further. But even just the perceptions or the fact that this is perceived as a problem is already resulting in significant concern. So regardless of whether or not that further analysis supports the idea that this could be a serious environmental challenge, we have to deal with it because it already affects the political support for the measure. And clearly, that this approach chosen in the proposal of continuing free allocation on a declining scale over 10 years offers sort of a temporary reprieve, but bear in mind from the very outset, the free allocation, so from 2026, will be declining, even if it's only 10% per year until it's completely gone. So the challenges will begin from the outset and become more and more pressing over time. And if the further analysis of this challenge revealed that it is actually a serious problem, producers do have very significant or derive a lot of revenue from exports, and there is also an environmental corollary to that, then we will need some alternative solution. We think that a number of alternative or complementary policies that we've listed and that we discuss in the report that I also showed in the previous slide can help significantly, but they take time. Whether it is product requirements, whether it's carbon contracts for difference, whether it is intensified support for research, development, and deployment, and of course, international cooperation. All of these help, but they take time to work. They take time to implement it and to start showing effect. And so the sooner we start or really intensify those efforts, the better. And in the interim, as sort of the declining free allocation intensifies this challenge and heightens the concerns, we should also think about, well, can we do something within the CBAM? There are concerns about the legality of using any sort of export-related rebates or export rebates linked to exports. There will have to be more discussion. There's very different views on whether or not this can be reconciled with the WTO. So we need to explore this further. And of course, also look at the environmental impacts of both doing something on exports or not doing something on exports. I want to briefly mention that ERCC next year will be looking at this as one of the big issues in the third phase of the CBAM project. So expect more from us on this very question. And with that, I think I can hand over to probably Aaron.
So I'm going to tackle a couple of issues. Thank you, Michael. Both of which have as a starting point a similar gap. And that gap is that the current proposal for a CBAM as put forward by the Commission does not cover indirect emissions. There's a reason for this and a problem with this. The problem with this is that most of the emissions involved in the production of the goods that are proposed to be covered under the CBAM involve indirect emissions. They are not direct emissions, those emissions that are emitted during the production process. And so therefore, by failing to cover those indirect emissions, we are failing to cover the majority of the emissions involved in the production of goods, and similarly, failing to incentivize the reduction of those emissions. The first part of that gap also involves the fact that when we're talking about indirect emissions and indirect carbon costs, part of that gap also involves the fact that electro-intensive industries, those that would be most presumably in need of coverage of indirect emissions under the CBAM, don't really want that to happen at present because they are facing costs within the European Union in excess of those costs that would only be a result of their indirect emissions. The EU emissions, the EU electricity pricing mechanism is based on marginal costs. That is, the cost is set, the price of electricity is set by the last producer to be called on in the order of the grid, and that will be the highest cost producer. And that producer will typically be producing at high cost because it is a carbon intensive producer paying for EU ETS allowances. Therefore, the price of electricity under the EU is high relative to its actual, higher than would be reflected simply by the average cost of the mix, given what the actual indirect emissions would be in the mix. In other words, the EU producers are paying higher electricity costs based on the inflation of the electricity cost from the need to buy EU allowances than their competitors would be paying. The competitors if we did extend the CBAM to cover indirect costs, there would be protection for those costs borne by foreign producers and domestic producers as a result of their straight indirect emissions. But these indirect carbon costs, which are an artifact of the EU marginal pricing regime for electricity, would not be covered. So EU producers would be at a disadvantage. What to do about this? If we can't solve this problem, we can't really bring indirect emissions into the CBAM. The current way to deal with this is a compensation mechanism. The EU has agreed under state aid rules that member states can compensate producers for those indirect carbon costs under certain circumstances up to certain levels. The scheme is voluntary by member states at this point. I think it's 13 member states have approved. 13 member states have approved plans for doing so. It's partial up to 75% of the costs, but the cost calculation is complex enough that it does not necessarily accurately reflect the indirect carbon costs borne by those firms. And one alternative to those costs at a firm level, the so-called super cap, which allows for 1.5% of gross value added to be compensated, is, while it's not complex, again, does not really accurately reflect carbon costs as such. So what do we take away from all this? We would like in the long run for the CBAM to cover indirect costs. This would help protect EU producers with high indirect costs, and would help motivate foreign producers with those costs to decrease them. It would bring that coverage of the main element of costs under the CBAM. However, for the moment, while and this is directly related to the next set of issues as well, we don't see the situation allowing for bringing those costs under the CBAM. So in the short term, we maintain the system for compensation for indirect costs, and we only cover direct costs under the CBAM, but eventually we would like to see them brought under the CBAM. As part of the way to make that possible, we would like to see a reform of the system for compensation for indirect costs such that it more accurately reflects indirect carbon costs, and such that it is less of a voluntary patchwork of schemes applied in different measure by EU member states, and is more comprehensively and systematically applied in a way that accurately reflects the costs of indirect emissions, or the indirect carbon costs faced by those firms. That's the first part of the two-part issue dealing with indirect emission. The second part, if we can go to the next slide, doesn't at first seem like it deals with indirect emissions. We're talking here about the need to avoid resource shuffling and other forms of by which foreign producers might avoid the intent or thwart the intent of the CBAM, the proposed CBAM. Why do I say this has anything to do with indirect emissions? Resource shuffling really is an issue only if we have covered, to any significant extent, only if we have covered indirect emissions under the CBAM. The electricity used by producers is what really separates clean producers from dirty producers. Direct emissions are more or less homogeneous globally across producers, We really see that variation in emissions profiles when we look at the indirect emissions. And the scope for resource shuffling is greater when we bring in indirect emissions. What is resource shuffling? Resource shuffling is the process by which, without changing anything about their production profiles, foreign firms can take those aspects of their current production, which may be clean, low carbon, and divert them such that they're exported to the EU in compliance with the CBAM, facing no CBAM adjustment fee or a low adjustment, and take those elements of their current production which are dirty and reroute them to serve domestic markets or other third country markets. So the result is that you don't have any reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions as a result of the CBAM, but you do have foreign producers entering the EU market at a relatively low cost. And it's quite easy to make that kind of shuffle if we have indirect emissions included, because it's easy to say that the grid that you sourced your electricity from, you're taking just that part of the grid that had low emissions profiles. That's quite a simple thing to do without actually changing anything. So this is one form of avoidance strategy. Two others that we look at: transshipment, the idea that we have some exempted countries under the proposed CBAM, those with linked ETS systems. If we have goods shipped to those countries with high embedded GHG, and those countries don't have a similar CBAM, then those countries can simply transship those goods to the EU without CBAM costs. And this is another way to thwart the intent of the CBAM. And finally, there is cost absorption. What do we mean by cost absorption? Let's imagine that you have a firm, a foreign firm, of which only 10% of its production is exported to the EU. For that firm, it's possible for the EU destined production to, in some sense, be subsidized by the rest of its production, such that the firm can lower the price at which it ships to the EU, goods shipped to the EU in a way to avoid the CBAM levy, and cross-subsidize that by means of 9/10 of its other production, slightly raising the prices it charges in those contexts. Not a great long-term strategy, but predatory pricing is a fact, dumping is a fact, it happens all the time. What do we advise to do about these particular problems? Of course, there are ways to deal with them, as Andre said, and as Michael has said, both within the CBAM and outside the CBAM. For resource shuffling, one way to deal with it outside of the CBAM would be to move to a excise-based charges, consumption charges, as we call them in this report, which does not suffer from the problem of resource shuffling. In the variation of it, which uses a default value for GHG intensity of materials, does not suffer from resource shuffling problems. There are a couple of other ways you could deal with it by instruments within the CBAM, and we don't focus on that in this report, but we mentioned them. One is to demand national averages in terms of GHG intensity from exporters and solely on their indirect emissions. That is to say, a good that shows up at the border, we wouldn't ask what the actual emissions of its electricity consumption were. We would base our assumptions on a national average of electricity and GHG intensity. You avoid resource shuffling thereby. Another would be to delay the process of free allocation phase out, to more or less delay the implementation of the CBAM. This buys time during which the carbon intensity of EU electricity production is falling. It is currently falling and will continue to fall. And the more it does, the less this is a problem. How do we deal with transshipment? We need strong anti-circumvention protection. We need a mandate for those linked countries to also implement a forceful CBAM at their borders. How do we deal with cost absorption? This is really a dumping problem. And we deal with dumping problems typically through means, not by circumvention within an anti-circumvention within an instrument like the CBAM, but through means like anti-dumping investigations, trade remedy law within the European Union. We also recommend that in this case, we deal with it that way. passing it back to Mike now. Or now
Alexander.
to Alexandra, actually.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, so the next gap we're looking at concerns product coverage down the value chain within the covered sectors, the proposed sectors. So the proposed CBAM covers 4 basic material sectors, so not looking at electricity. And within these 4 sectors, the coverage extends down the value chain to a certain extent. And some of the covered sectors have complex and long downstream value chains. And there is a lot of trading in semi-finished and finished products. And not all of these more processed products are included in Annex 1 of the proposed regulation in the proposed list of covered goods. So excluding some of these more processed products from CBAM potentially creates a risk of shifting carbon leakage downstream in the value chain. And this could especially be the case for products that have a high share of the carbon intensive raw material, and the processing results in limited value added. And there are a few options, policy options that can help limit this risk. Of course, expanding looking at CBAM, within the CBAM, expanding the coverage, its coverage to downstream products would effectively address this gap, but this might not be desirable, at least at the beginning of the implementation of CBAM, because it increases the complexity of the instrument. There could already be an assessment already now of the risk of carbon leakage for such downstream products, with a view to potentially covering them in the medium or longer term. Looking more at alternative instruments such as consumption charges, they can address this gap, as they are a means to ensuring that the cost of carbon is internalized along the supply chain, and they also apply to products that are placed on the EU market, whether they are imported or produced domestically. In terms of complementary measures, in the near term, the risk can be limited through product standards, or through providing compensation to downstream producers whose products are not covered by CBAM but are found to be at risk of carbon leakage. However, providing such compensation risks been found to be subsidies under trade law. For the next challenge, if we move to the next slide. Thank you. This is about the impact of CBAM on development and LDCs. It's already some of the EU's trading partners in developing countries have been raising concerns that the CBAM would have an impact on their development. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities is a legitimate concern, in particular for LDCs and seeds, and this might justify a special treatment of these countries. But at the same time, the proposed CBAM sets out no exemptions for LDCs and seeds from its geographical scope, and for good reasons, as this could raise legal and circumvention risks. And also, the proposed CBAM does not provide any provisions regarding how regarding using the revenues to provide support for climate-related purposes in developing countries, neither. So we think, well, providing targeted support, including capacity building and technical assistance to CBAM exposed developing countries can effectively address these negative impacts. It can support decarbonization processes and building up institutional capacities. And of course, this could be done within the CBAM through recycling of CBAM revenues, but it can also, not necessarily, can also be done through channeling other EU funds for the purpose.
Okay.
All right, the last one, and I'll do this one quickly. I think we want to move to our overall takeaways and then, of course, our panelists. But it's not necessarily a gap, and so we kind of rephrase the opening. Instead of calling it a gap, it's more of an opportunity. We're all, of course, aware that the EU is by no means the only jurisdiction that is concerned about leakage as it accelerates its climate policy ambition, and that is exploring the use of border carbon adjustments. There's formal discussions in Canada, in the UK, the United States has had a number of different initiatives. So this gives an opportunity to avoid sort of a patchwork of confusing and different approaches to applying unilateral leakage protections, and to instead cooperate on trying to harmonize some of the principles and practices there, and generally try to reduce the administrative burden on the jurisdictions, as well as the cost of compliance for the trade partner producers. What can be done here is, of course, to start a discussion, some sort of semi-formal or formal discussion on common principles and practices, things such as the objectives of these instruments of border carbon adjustments, what are accepted objectives to avoid sort of sliding into a protectionist, abusing them or misusing them as protectionist tools, and really focusing on the environmental objective. What are some of the accepted uses of the revenue? Can one have a conversation on that? How to deal with crediting of different types of foreign policies, and so on and so forth. There's a number of course, tricky implementation issues that could be fruitfully addressed in such a dialogue. And looking into history, of course, we have some precedent of that. So when the increased use of value-added taxation necessitated application of border tax adjustments some 50 years ago in the 1970s, the GATT created a working party to discuss border tax adjustments, and it was relatively successful, relatively decentralized, not a top-down process so much, but still it gave sort of a concerted, a consensus, if you like, approach on how to deal with these different applications of VAT. And ultimately, we think, again, this is something that takes time. It wouldn't make sense for the EU to hold off with the implementation and rollout of the CBAM. And anyway, there is a lengthy sort of implementation timeline with this initially just data collection, and then eventually from 2026 only the implementation. So that may accommodate efforts at the same time to progress with such discussions. We also are somewhat skeptical, I think, in our discussions that right away this should be geared towards being a club in which not only discussions happen about how to implement BCAs, but making membership conditional on very hard formal sort of levels of ambition, a certain minimum carbon price or something like that, because we think there's not only some risks to that, but it would also just take more time. So really, we think the way to go here would be to start early with somewhat more informal conversation, again, on principles and practices. That can then, over time, of course, evolve into something somewhat more ambitious, such as a climate or carbon club that also looks at a minimum level of ambition, such as some entities like the IMF have proposed. And with that, I think I give back to Andre, who closes out the presentation for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Michael, Aaron, Alexandra. Look, it's you want to go into takeaways without repeating what everybody else said before. But I think that's why I think I've got a few slides, but I think I'll be very brief, is the fact that CBAM is necessary given the fact that you have asymmetrical climate policy environment globally, the high level of ambition, and the fact that we are running out of free allocation. I think that sooner or later, maybe you can argue with the pace, you can argue with a number of things, but at some point it's going to run out of the stuff. The fact that it's becoming quite clear that even the gaps that exist, the CBAM needs to be flanked by other policies and measures. Again, I like to imagine as a jigsaw puzzle. And the gaps will not be the same in all the sectors. Some sectors are more exposed to exports, some less, but nevertheless, they're all into this globalized economy. This is an important item for all of them. The fact that this puzzle will evolve over time, the environment in which it operates will evolve over time. There will be new development, there will be new discovery as you apply the CBAM. You'll discover things about it that you'll be surprised and shocked about the things that that you haven't seen before. It's a bit like the ETS. When we designed it, we never saw some of the flaws in it that then became quite obvious and apparent. And the same thing is for such an important component of the European package that deals with climate change. There are things in here that we will discover. And as such, what I wanted to talk about, I'm not going to go again, is the fact that you have gaps, and gaps is exports. I think that my colleagues have spoken about it, the importance of exports and the way that you can address this. The other one is indirect emissions, resource shuffling, expand downstream product, and increasing convergence. Resource shuffling, it's an important one. It's something that it's to some degree you could argue, tell me there is resource shuffling. Well, I can't tell you because I haven't had the BCA before. So that is okay. There are the instances where you can show it. But if you have worked, as long as some of us have worked in this field, you'll know that in the field of trade, what you look for and that will happen. I think people will also argue whether what is the exact objective of a CBAM, and is it the objective to change the whole sector in the country, or to make sure that we're paying the same cost for what we're importing? And that's a fair question to ask. And then two things that needs to be on the table, which are not wildly popular and not probably controversial, is the fact that if there is only planet A, there is no planet B, then is there a point at which you start looking at trade rules? WTO, like everything else, like the carbon market, like many things, is a game construct. And is this going to get in the way of addressing climate change? Nobody suggests, and to make it clear, nobody's suggesting breaking WTO rules, because that's a simple answer. The answer is no. The Commission doesn't want that, but that in that WTO rules, they will be tested, they'll be interpreted, they will be reformed. I think the WTO is under some reform pressure anyway, so something to think about. And finally, there's so many moving parts in this. You see the moving parts in ETS, the moving parts in the CBAM. In the end, the old nirvana of a harmonized carbon price. It's probably as complex as anything else, but it's also something that is a tool that may become necessary, maybe not in this NDC, but in the future NDCs. So I will stop here. Let's thank again my colleagues and also Dario Dipka, who's not on the screen, for all the efforts that have gone into putting this paper together. It is, they're all expecting something in the Christmas stocking for this. And now we'll go into the order of Oliver, Peter, Karsten, and Marcus. That way the Commission has always the last word. So Oliver, you go first.
So how long do I have, Andre?
Well, as long as you think it's reasonably. When you when you look
No.
at my face, you know it's too much.
Okay, yeah, you don't want to trust me with that. So yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you for this very comprehensive and excellent paper. Another piece of good work from you guys. First of all, I'd say I very strongly agree with the framing as you lay it out, right? So the argument that effectively where we currently sit, CBAM is probably the most plausible, most feasible solution to tackle carbon leakage going forward. Because free allocation is becoming unsustainable, and the other alternatives, as you've discussed, have serious question marks about them. So I would strongly agree with that. Particularly on the climate clubs issue, for example, I think Agora would strongly support the idea of certain forms of climate clubs. So cooperative clubs that seek to advance agreement on common principles around carbon leakage, which I know is close to Aaron's heart. But also supporting the creation of lead markets, supporting common data reporting on embedded carbon, etc., to advance industrial transition. So this makes a lot of sense. Where we're much more skeptical is the idea that we could somehow agree on common levels of carbon pricing equivalent to the EU's with the US, with China, with major trading partners accounting for large shares of these product markets. That's very unlikely to happen for quite some time. It's very complicated technically also to align carbon prices, let alone aligning implicit or non-carbon price-based policies. So we think clubs and CBAM are probably more complements than substitutes. We're also, of course, and Carsten will disagree with me, but very skeptical on the consumption charge as an alternative to CBAM, primarily because it doesn't, as Michael said, it doesn't actually tackle carbon leakage. It raises revenue, which is one thing that you need, but it doesn't actually do away with the fundamental problem, which is that free allocation is not sustainable. If we come then to sort of what the additional policy packages, I think this is a crucial question too, right? So Agora has been arguing for quite some time, basically the more we decarbonize, the better off our industrials will be, and the faster we decarbonize, the better off our industrials will be when they have to compete in a world where carbon is not free. And so the better we can put in place a package of policies to support that decarbonization, the better. In this regard, Agora's put out publications on this. We've called for a clean industry package as part of the European Green Deal. Very quickly, there's three elements. We say, look, upstream, we need to basically develop the right infrastructure. Access to clean, affordable power and hydrogen, key feedstocks, is critical. Hydrogen in particular has to be prioritized to industrial end usages and to no regrets options. In the midstream, we need obviously carbon contracts for difference. We need to support the scale up and deployment of key low carbon technologies. And then downstream, we have to create markets, right? So this is overlapping with some of the recommendations you have. In terms of creating markets, one thing that we think is particularly important that maybe you don't mention so much in your paper is embedded carbon limits. So embedded carbon limits are probably a bit easier in some ways to implement initially than CO2 product requirements because they focus more on the final product and they provide more flexibility to value chains to meet certain carbon decarbonization objectives for those final products. They do have the advantage, though, of being very complementary to CBAM in the sense that they would require the same data on embedded carbon along the relevant value chains. And they also, I think, would help to go some way to addressing the sort of the circumvention problem, because embedded carbon reporting could potentially be expanded to further products down the value chain, or actually need to be ultimately to be effective. Maybe just on some specific points. So, on indirect emissions, again, I think Agora will be very much aligned with what you say in your paper. We think indirect emissions will need to be included from circa 2030 in the CBAM because electrification will be a key way to decarbonize these sectors. And so otherwise there's a risk of circumvention of the CBAM, of course. But initially there is this resource shuffling problem, right? Which is not a problem in itself, but to the extent it leads to carbon leakage in the short run, it could be for electro-intensives. We think the main solution to this is basically to phase in the indirect emissions, as a second step. So basically to allow the EU power market time to decarbonize significantly. By 2030, it should be below 100 grams per kilowatt hour. at this point, maybe it's a simpler task. One can also try to tax indirect emissions in third countries in a way that as closely mimics as possible the EU's indirect carbon costs. On product shifting, I think, so the idea of shifting to downstream products, we've looked at this a little bit, and we think that by and large, the coverage that the Commission proposes for a first step of CBAM introduction is actually pretty good. It covers a lot of steel, a lot of aluminium products that are kind of basic to intermediate products. It doesn't cover all intermediate products, but a lot of those intermediate products, if you're even at 100 euros a ton, you're talking about maybe a 1 to 4%, 5% maybe maximum increase in the total cost of those products. Whether that at this point justifies the additional complexity of adding all of those products into the system at this stage, I think is questionable, although perhaps at a later stage one could come back to that. And then finally on exports, and then I'll stop. I think on exports, the key concern here that we would have is on the risk of retaliation using countervailing duties. When we actually look at which trading partners would be most likely to do that, we think it's likely to be larger ones that have a strong political opposition to the CBAM. So countries like Brazil, maybe Russia, countries like this, perhaps China. When you actually add up how much the EU exports of the relevant products in those sectors, it's actually not a majority of the exports. It's more like 15 to 25%. It's still, though, not insignificant. But what we would probably suggest is, look, if the issue is really not so much the economic distortion from having free allocation to exported products, it's more about the politics of CBAM and about initial opposition, then why not introduce an export rebate in 2 steps? So introduce, first of all, the CBAM without the rebates, maybe introduce it a bit slower than is proposed by the Commission, support industrials to abate, and then in 2029, 2030, come back to this question and say, if at that point we still see a risk, we will freeze the phase-down of free allocation to the exported production. That would, in our view, probably allow some of the initial blowback that's all political around the CBAM to go past, while still keeping the door open to protecting exporters further on down the line. Okay, I'll leave that thought out there for people to pick up, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Oliver. Peter, you go next, and then Karsten and Marcus.
Great, thank you, Andre. So briefly, for folks who don't know, whether or not you know me is irrelevant. I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It's a Washington-based think tank that really is there to promote transatlantic cooperation in a range of areas. That has included this whole question of CBAM. I think one of the early papers on CBAM was done by Jennifer Hillman in 2013 and by the German Marshall Fund. And the work that I've done recently has been kind of a continuation of that. You know, I have to say that I've been really impressed by all of the work that ERCST has done on this. It really is very good. In my own work, I read, I think, just about everything you guys have done. And I think that the reason I'm mentioning it is that we've been asked to comment on one paper. And you said this in your introduction, Andre, but to all of the people who are participating in this, it's hard to see this one paper as an individual item. You really do have to consider it in the context, because I think that it fits in that broader context, and it's a pity we can't talk about all of it at once. I think one of the things that's missing in this report, and I have to raise it, is because you explicitly aren't doing it in the context of an evaluation of the actual proposal by the Commission. And I get it, and I understand structurally why that's part of this, but I think that it raises something, because you said, Andre, that there's no alternative to having a CBAM. And that's the premise of the report that you've written. And I think that that's one of the things that needs to be thought about. And you can only think about it if you do an in-depth evaluation of what the Commission has proposed and why it's proposed what it's done. I think that the Commission was extremely good in underscoring that its proposal was meant to be an environmental proposal, not a competitiveness one. And even the way you've set it up, You evaluate things on an environment basis, on a competitiveness basis, which is what the discussion of CBAM is about. But the Commission was trying very hard to make sure it was not seen as a competitiveness one, but as something that really addressed the question of carbon leakage, in the sense that if the EU took certain measures in the Fit for 55 package, would that have a net increase in global carbon emissions? And the reason I mention it is because one of the things that strikes me, I think one of the things we need to think about generally is if there is a certain reduction in Europe of carbon emissions, and as a result of it, there is an increase in carbon emissions elsewhere, but less than the reduction in European emissions, is that a net increase in global greenhouse gas emissions? Is that an environmental purpose? Does that create an environmental problem that we need to address? And I think that that's one of, if you look carefully at what the Commission said, basically there is no net increase in greenhouse gas emissions, even if you implement the entirety of the Fit for 55 package, even if you get rid of the free allowances and you don't have a CBAM, the net increase in greenhouse gas emissions in other countries from exporting here would not be a problem. So I just want to put that out there because I think it's something that that gets lost in this discussion sometimes. Because I think that again, for me, the issue is whether or not this is going to be a trade or an environmental or competitiveness issue. And the more that it's done as an environmental issue, the more it will be able to be accepted. One of the things in the way you've set this up that I'd have a little critique of is your fifth pillar is political and diplomatic feasibility. And when you put those two together, what it sounds to me is like you're trying to address the domestic politics of the environmental measures that are being taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the external acceptability. And I think those two things need to be separated. I think it's actually very important that they be separated because, again, the competitiveness issue is really to some extent more a domestic political one. I think, but in general, I think that, given that those two criticisms, the way the paper is structured, the way you've looked at all of these issues, the way you've brought them out, I think has been really good. To me, I think the key is, again, going to be the diplomatic one, which you do stress. In the end, it's not a question of whether or not this is WTO compatible. I think that the Commission tries to keep things environmental precisely to make sure that they can do a better job of arguing WTO compatible, because the minute they bring in the competitiveness aspects, that's going to be more difficult. But I think in the end, what you really need to do is convince other countries that if the EU is going to, or any country, is going to undertake major, very costly sorts of measures, where there are going to be dislocations, that you're going to have to have some way to mitigate that and to phase it out over time. And in that sense, the justification of CBAM is basically, if I'm going to do this, if you, other countries, want me to seriously reduce my carbon emissions, you have to give me some political room to do that. Because basically, I don't think that you can do this in a WTO compatible way, because one of the things that you talk about is the production process methods. That's the product, what you call product requirements. That's where you're going to have the problems in a WTO context, I think. One of the things as well that's important about the actual proposal that you're not, allowed to kind of get into in your paper is that it is focused on plant-specific emissions and whether or not plants can reach a default value. And it argues and allows that the foreign producers, if they actually produce at better, greenhouse gas emissions than what European default is, then they would not have to pay under CBAM. And in terms of I think what Oliver was just saying about the focus on the 4 sectors and the events that it covers is important, because I think the Commission mentions that about 1,000 facilities are affected by the way the CBAM has been, or the CBAM has been addressed, set up. And if that's the case, then one of the issues really is going to be, how do you help foreign countries build the capability to have effectively best available technology, lowest greenhouse gas emissions for their products? That's essentially, from an environmental point of view, what we're trying to do, right? Which kind of, and I'm just going to close with this because I think it creates a real tension that we're going to see in this. One of the things you could do if you're recycling this, if you're recycling the CBAM or other things, the capacity building that you've talked about in the paper as part of the international diplomatic effort, you could go to Turkey, Ukraine, Russia, Mozambique, and say, how can we help you get best available technologies in your plant so that you are actually emitting the least possible amount of carbon? That would be the right thing to do from an environmental point of view, from a climate point of view. But the problem is that would actually also increase the tensions from a competitiveness point of view. It's going to be tough, but I do want to compliment both you guys for this report, because I love the way you've done it, set it up, and as well I want to compliment the Commission for trying to design a CBAM that actually pulls all this stuff together as best as possible.
Okay. All right, Karsten.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks very much for the invite to discuss this paper. I very much enjoyed in this paper that it is finally looking at a package of elements that come together, which I think is really important, not least because the Commission is putting forth the Fit for 55 package of a set of elements that need to fit together. And I think that's an important part. I think also very well characterized what are the gaps, the challenges now that the Commission's proposal is on the table. And I agree with Peter. I feel the Commission has made the best approach of bringing together a proposal based on specified carbon intensities to apply a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So I think that's a really good basis to kind of advance now the discussions in terms of how to deal with this option or with alternative options as we go forward. I feel we really are right now at a crossroad in terms of a set of big challenges. One is, I think, challenge and opportunity. We have the strong commitments now from industry, from finance sector, from not only Europe, but global alliances towards climate neutrality, which is great. A really good starting point. Now it's about turning this into reality. And if you talk to companies, if you talk to the finance sector, at least the sectors covered here, they cannot take forward investments in climate neutral technologies because the investment framework incentives are lacking at the moment. And at the same time, the finance sector doesn't fund it if they don't see that there's a business case of a project they are funding. So I think we really have urgency to get this price signal, the carbon price signal right in these sectors if we want to deliver our NDC, our commitments that we made in Europe in Glasgow. And I think it's one way of interpreting it. The carbon price of 80 euros that we are observing right now is a strong signal that we got things wrong. Because what is it signaling? We've right now high gas prices, and all analysts look at what is the option of shifting from coal to gas if gas prices are so high. The largest share of emissions is increasingly going to be from industry. So what are the mitigation options? Clean processes, more material efficiency, more recycling. But right now the carbon price signal is muted for these activities, and the Commission proposal delays any relevant carbon price into the 2030s for these activities. So effectively, we've muted the carbon pricing from ETS, and the response is that any changes in the supply-demand balance gets the carbon price really high. So we really have to kind of urgently get the carbon price functioning in this market if we want to get the price signal in the range, which I think most people expected. Particularly, all the modelers, they model always the carbon price signal working, but it doesn't actually work. And that's why they come up to kind of far more moderate price developments if they don't look at the real world implementation and the delays of the implementation of the CBAM right now. I've got 2 or 3 slides, if I may, Andre, to get us a bit into this Christmas period. Peter asked in terms of what is the fundamental issues that we are facing with this proposal. And my sense is this picture characterizes it quite nicely. Why are you looking at the splinter in the eye of your brother rather than looking into the beam at home? So in a way, I think the challenge of the Commission's CBAM proposal and the entire discussion is very much this balance between what we want to do domestically and what we want to internationally. And by focusing on an approach that is looking at specific carbon intensities of the imports, we do want to encourage trade partners to kind of reduce, mitigate CO2 emissions, to implement carbon pricing mechanisms in partner countries. It comes at the cost that was quite clearly spelled out, that we can't apply to exports, to indirect emissions, to the value chain, that we have the resource shuffling challenges, and that trade partners in least developed countries feel we don't account for what they are doing. I think that's why we really need to look at the alternative of a CBAM based on standardized values per steel, per cement, clinker, per other materials, which then allows, and I think that was indicated in the presentation quite nicely, to cover the various materials, to cover the value chain, all the elements that come with it. It does explicitly only look into Europe, such an approach with standardized value. It doesn't kind of have any ambition or potential to do something outside of Europe. It would then come back to the issue of policy packages, to look of other cooperation mechanisms to work with partner countries to support them to cooperate on the transition to climate neutrality. And how this can be done, it's a package. And I think it only makes sense to look at it as a package. If you look at individual components, it doesn't work. But the package of looking at this as part of the 55 package, I think makes sense and can be implemented as part of what is in there. So it comprises 3 elements. It's the product. Producers of basic materials are liable for the climate contribution. The revenues are used to fund carbon contracts for differences, for climate neutral processes and recycling, and imports of materials and products are also covered, and the liability, if it's at a standardized value, it's an excise charge, can be waived for exports. It has been positively assessed as elements in the support study for the CBAM, and also is in the impact assessment. And the impact assessment of the Commission is misspecified in terms of the parameters. That's why it kind of looks a bit funny. It uses the established instruments we know and the trade partners know already, and meets therefore also WTO and administrative requirements, limiting the risks and uncertainties to unlock investments now already in this decade. So it can be a transition path towards some global carbon pricing alliances that we mentioned earlier on. But it doesn't have these international incentives that we talked about. How does it work? The idea is that the steel producers, per ton of hot rolled steel that is produced, you currently produce roughly 2 tons of CO2. You remain subject to the ETS for your emissions. You get free allocation at the best available conventional technology benchmark by the allowances above this part. For the transition period until climate neutrality, this is continued. To plants that are part of a company, have transition plans to climate neutrality. And by the very nature of the definition, there are sufficient allowances in the ETS cap to cover the emissions of installations under the ETS cap. Otherwise, the price goes up, as we observe right now. We complement this with this climate contribution, which is levied per ton of the material that is put into the market. And it's a charge, not on the input, but on the output, and which is at the same level as the free allocation upstreams is happening. This makes sure that ultimately the full carbon costs are reflected in material prices. We have the full incentives for material efficiency, for recycling, and therefore also contribute to moderating the carbon price because there are more actors that can respond to the carbon price. Clean production processes get supported for their incremental cost compared to the conventional processes with carbon contracts for differences, there is sufficient revenues to do so because the climate contribution raises these revenues. This is something which in Europe I'm very much concerned about. Germany has in the coalition agreement committed to kind of provide them from the national budget to scale up the green technologies. France, Netherlands in a similar situation, also to some extent Sweden. Only the northwest of Europe would do this at a national level unless we have European scale resources to make an inclusive transition at European scale. And that is something which only, in my understanding right now, for this decade can happen with a climate contribution, which would raise the revenues to allow for facilities across Europe to transit to climate neutrality. Finally, this climate contribution is levied on conventional and clean steel production. It's, like any excise, also levied on imports of materials and of products comprising these materials. And as it is just looking at the weight of steel, how much steel is in this part, you don't have to do extraterritorial tracing or anything like this. So administratively, it's easy and relatively cheap to implement. And you can ask as a participant in the value chain to say, I want to buy the product and take the responsibility for this liability rather than having the steel producer pay this liability, which then allows market participants to self-select. That comes back to Alexandra's point on value chain, if they want to participate in such a scheme. And if you then export a product, you can waive the liability. Therefore, also the export part is covered. So all the gaps that were identified in the report are covered with such an approach. And with the partners of the climate-friendly materials platforms, think tanks across Europe, we've put this forward under this title, Closing the Green Deal for Industry, addressing the carbon leakage risks with continued free allocation to existing installation during the transition period, applying carbon contracts for differences to fund the incremental cost of clean processes, and using the climate contribution to have sufficient scale revenues and to kind of apply the incentives along the value chain. The assessments that we did also with colleagues from the US and also Michael Mehling suggest that this is an approach that is robust to ACM concerns, because we have a justification for the free allocation to avoid double charging. We have a legal basis, a European basis as environmental regulation, and we have done a lot of additional assessments which are available on the website from the partners of Climate-Friendly Materials Platform. And I think it very much fits the theme that Andrea, you put forward here, to think of how a package of elements can help us to address the challenge of making CBAM work. And I think CBAM based on a default value in this approach would do the trick. Let's stop here and look for the further discussion.
Thanks. And last but not least, Marcos, you can tell us actually what the Commission totally think of what we said so far.
Thank you. And well, first of all, thank you for the invitation for participating in this event, and apologies on behalf of Mete Quinn, my head of unit, that is not feeling well today. Very quick, I'm Marcos Gonzalez, as Andre said, head of sector for free allocation under the ETS, and I have been following the CBAM discussions a little bit since the beginning, since the Green Deal was published. And in that respect, I also have to thank this forum for all the work that you have been doing so far. I think you have been really putting together a lot of knowledge in this past more than 2 years now. I think that most of the things that you have said, I mean, I could potentially agree with, and I think you normally bring to the table some balanced debates. The first one, and working on free allocation, I can say that I agree with you that if we look at CBAM, has to be with the idea of it being our carbon leakage instrument to looking into the future. We are confident that up to 2030 free allocation can do the trick, but post 2030 first is not really defined in the directive, and second, even if it will be defined, we will have a declining cap. The free allocation share is limited, and there will not be enough unless sectors decarbonize much faster than what we think is possible. So on that, I think I can agree with you, Andrea and Oliver. There are a couple of things that I wanted to mention. The first one I saw in a slide presented by Michael Mehling, in which basically I think you were defining the CBAM and free allocation as possible complementary tools. You know that, and this I will not repeat myself, since the beginning we have been saying that two tools for addressing carbon leakage and addressing the same problem need to be alternative. If not, we will run into problems with trading partners, with the WTO. And we will also be reducing the incentives for European installations to decarbonize, which is also not a minor problem. I think we took big steps from that general approach, and now we are talking about phasing out free allocation for the CBAM sectors by 2035. This is not tomorrow. This is 13 years from now, very soon. So I think that in your slide you mentioned an expression buying time. It buys time. Indeed, the idea is providing a credible and realistic pathway to these sectors to decarbonize. And then something very important that was mentioned by Karsten, and I think it was also mentioned by Peter, I don't know, is that you have to look at the CBAM as a part of the full Fit for 55 proposal. The CBAM does not come out of the blue alone. It's related to the review of DTS, to better targeting free allocation on one side, but also you have to take into account that we want our sectors to decarbonize. We are increasing the size of the innovation fund. We are proposing to put the allocation that is not going to be granted for free into the innovation fund. That is probably also going to make use of carbon contracts for difference. So this is part of a full package for the decarbonizing industry. It's an environmental measure. Is part of our general approach, I would say. And then on more technical things that I think have been discussed many times. I mean, on indirect emissions, I think everyone in the virtual room, the debate very well. We have not proposed to cover the indirect emissions from the outset, but is subject to a review clause. There is something that was said that I don't agree 100%, which is that most of the emissions are indirect for the CBAM sectors. That is true, obviously, for some sectors, but is not 100% true for others. But then Oliver made a very good point. We want one of the pathways for industry to decarbonize is to electrify. So indirect emissions will become more important. There is no doubt about this. I can only agree that we would like to have a more harmonized system for indirect cost compensation or for addressing the possible risk of carbon leakage linked to indirect costs. I don't know if you remember, probably yes, we tried in the previous review of DTS, not in this one. We tried for the review that was finally published in 2018, and there was no agreement. It's a very difficult discussion with member states and the European Council because they have very different electricity mixes, and that didn't work last time. So we are continuing with the approach we had, which is trying at least to reduce the distortions in the internal market through indirect cost compensation. We see more and more member states making use of the guidelines of the possibility of compensating for indirect costs, but it's not an harmonized approach that is obvious for everyone. Something that is also for me very important is that if indirect emissions would be to be covered in the CBAM in the future, then we also need to review the system that we have for compensating indirect costs to state aid. So that needs to be seen also in conjunction. It's not that we can continue the same debate as with free allocation. In the end, indirect cost compensation would also need to be phased out if indirect costs leakage is addressed through the CBAM. And then I don't have that many more things to say on the value chain. I'm happy that someone said that the list of products or codes that we propose to cover in Annex 1 is good in the sense that I think it's a good start. We try to strike our balance between the feasibility of developing the CBAM in the first steps that we are taking now, and at the same time covering as much as possible of the value chain for avoiding the possible risk related to covering intermediate products and not the final products. But on this was, in my opinion, on the work I participated, this was a question of striking this balance, taking these concerns into account for not, but at the same time having something that we can implement. I think we can try to calculate embedded emissions on the steel plates that we import, but if we talk about the full value chain for a car in a first step, that would be extremely complicated thing to do. And on resource shuffling, for me, has always been kind of a very theoretical discussion in the sense that Is mentioned is something that what if someone would devote to the EU their exports of the products with a lowest carbon footprint, if I can call it like that. Well, in that case, I don't think that there is much, to be honest, that we can do under the CBAM. You were talking about postponing the phase out of reallocation, but that in the end is again buying time. I don't think that is addressing precisely resource shuffling, and at the same time, the option of basing the CBAM on the average emissions related to the production in the country of origin, for me that has another fundamental problem. You know that in the CBAM we are trying to mirror the ETS, which is working installation by installation. If we would be basing the CBAM on something that is a default value, regardless of how good or bad you are in your production in the country of origin, without giving you the opportunity to demonstrate that you are better than our default value, I'm sure we are running into WTO problems. And what is more important is something that is not very environmental consistent, because we are not rewarding the best and we are giving an advantage to the worst. And well, that would be my first set of reactions. Again, thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to continue the debate with you in the future.
Thank you, Marcos. Thanks to all of you. They have these football players that in my time they were the coaches were much older guys. Now they all seem to kind of take the boots off, and so I'm not a coach player, and I don't believe in the chairs entering into debate. So I'm dying to answer, but I can't answer because I'm gagged. But my colleagues are not. And I'm looking at them first. I think Peter had some comments. I think there were a few other comments you guys want to answer in preparation for. There are a number of things that people have raised in the chat, but I would urge them to raise their own little electronic hand, and I'm happy to give them the floor. I think that's a much more civilized thing than me filtering and potentially censoring questions that I don't like. They can take the floor and talk. But Michael or Alexandra or Aaron, do you guys have anything that you want to react to?
I can very selectively, while Aaron and Alexandra probably also prepare some reflections. First of all, needless to say, thank you to all respondents, all discussants. This really is sort of one of the greater gifts of having these kinds of events and having such thoughtful reflection on things we've written, because we're very realistic. The time and patience to actually read long reports is not in abundance these days with so much going on. And so this is very, very valuable and really appreciated. And I'll be very selective in what I respond to, partly because in some areas you also just have much deeper knowledge, and I think all I can do is absorb and promise to look into it in more depth. I'll start sort of in the sequence. Oliver, I want to think more about what you suggested with exports and thinking about whether or not, tactically it doesn't just make sense to explore solutions that may be challenged and see what happens, and then as a fallback, have a sort of plan B that one can then implement. And definitely, as I mentioned, we'll be looking into this next year, and I might pick your brain more on that. But thanks for suggesting it. Peter, you mentioned something, since I was the one looking at product requirements in the paper. We had very short descriptions of the complementary policies, obviously, and with good reason. This was about the policy portfolio, but still, I'd like to look in more depth in product requirements, because you raised the issue that there you will run into the process and production methods issue under the WTO. I've looked into the TBT agreement, etc., and especially also the existing product requirements for biofuels, for instance, or fuel quality for timber. So I'd like to look a little bit more into depth and see whether, in fact, this is as risky as it may seem, or whether or not the fact that we have a lot of precedent suggests that this can be a safe thing to explore very quickly as a complement to the CBAM, to avoid some of the issues we identified and that many of you also sort of highlighted. Carsten, it's not the first time we've talked about the excise or the climate contribution, and I fully will man up to the fact that I think from a WTO perspective, the climate contribution part is very solid. You're absolutely right. rebating something that is done at the consumption level in the form of an excise tax will avoid some of the troubles that we have with the EU ETS for exports. Absolutely. I still wonder, one thing that's still, as a tool sort of to deal with in a package to deal with leakage, you were saying like it makes sense to focus more inwardly. And the cynic or the realist in me wonders if the CBAM were to go away overnight and it's gone, if not, one of the biggest things we achieved was, in fact, that we've seen in Russia, we've seen in Ukraine and Turkey, we've seen in Morocco, we've even heard in Indonesia, the debate about CBAM has sparked a climate policy development or accelerated sort of domestic developments. Whether or not we may underestimate how important that is, however legally and politically and diplomatically sensitive that may be to try to influence other countries, I think it may not be an entirely unimportant piece. But I still acknowledge, there are definite strengths to what you described. And I think that in a way, maybe the way we evaluated it on the second slide, we were in one case looking at it in the context that is proposed and in one case not. So that may be inconsistent and we might want to correct that, because especially on the legal side, purely the consumption approach, very, very strong, no question. And finally, Marcus, one last quick remark. Absolutely, when we say that free allocation give you a complement, we're not thinking as simultaneous, no double protection, absolutely. We're thinking of those two instruments existing at the same time, which is exactly what the Commission proposed over time. The timeline and the details of how quick and so on, those are all things that can and should be discussed. But I think that you might acknowledge that we have both instruments, but not covering the same emissions. Of course, that's what we meant with complementary, just to avoid any misunderstanding. And now back to whoever wants to react as well.
All right. Any Alexandra or Aaron? Or Michael has covered the waterfront. Anyone else?
I could add a couple of thoughts. Like Michael, they're selectively chosen and don't do justice to the richness of the presentations we had. But just a couple of thoughts in order of speakers. First, on Peter's excellent intervention, to note that leakage is a concern whether it involves a net increase in emissions globally or not. Leakage is defined as simply the increase in emissions in another jurisdiction as a result of your domestic climate policies. So even if we have a straight on no increase in global emissions, leakage is still a problem if all of the emissions from the EU are simply transferred to another country as a result of EU policy. And I want to agree with Peter that one of the key challenges for the European Union in the implementation of whatever solutions it chooses are to try to garner international agreement on its approach and the need for its approach. So we noted that the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities is to some extent violated by an instrument that demands other countries bear some of the burden of the EU's dealing with its own embedded carbon consumption. That's true, but it is also true, and this amplifies what Peter has said, that the CBDRRC principle demands political leadership and demands leadership in mitigation ambition from developed countries. And as Peter said, it's hard to imagine how you get that kind of leadership without some kind of mechanism to protect against the prospects of leakage. And from a political perspective, the prospects of loss of competitiveness. I don't agree that we need to get that kind of agreement in order to somehow mitigate the possibility of a WTO challenge. I think that's going to happen anyway. I don't think PPMs is the major issue we will face in that challenge. I think those have been dealt with in rulings like shrimp turtle, but I won't get into those weeds. On Karsten's points, I mean, there are two elements to the consumption, to the excise option that you, Karsten, and I have discussed previously. That there are challenges to a CBAM. There are also challenges to this option, and two of them that I think are central. One is the need to continue free allocation at a benchmark level, even when we are decarbonizing industry. That, to me, is straight on WTO trade risky. That will be seen, in my view, as an export subsidy. The other is the administrative difficulty because the strength of this proposal is that it puts a carbon price throughout the value chain. But it's also one of the weaknesses in that you have to decide when a computer or a car shows up at your border, what the weight of the material, the covered material is in that. You need to have default values ready at hand for thousands of goods that are varied in their scope. You think of automobiles and apply that. So there are some administrative and technical difficulties there. And to Marcos, I mean, I'm just picking up on the stuff that piques my interest here, of course. The process of, obviously, if the CBAM is extended to cover scope 2 or indirect emissions, it would involve a phase out of the current mechanism for compensation for indirect carbon costs. Yes, that's clear. But you still need some sort of mechanism that compensates for the differential faced by EU firms. So let's say we have complete coverage under the CBAM of indirect emissions, and that applies to both domestic firms who are paying the price of those emissions through the ETS charges on their electricity, and it applies to foreign firms that are paying under the regime. You still need to account for the fact that those foreign firms you have this artifact of the EU marginal pricing system that is charging domestic firms a higher cost than they would had they been subject to an average pricing system. So you need even with the full coverage under the CBAM, you need some kind of a compensation mechanism, but it's not the mechanism we have now, right? I think that's clear. It does mean if you are covering scope 2 emissions at the border, it means that you are not exactly mirroring the ETS, because the ETS does not impose a charge for indirect emissions. It does, however, make that charge felt by EU producers when they purchase electricity that has been covered by the ETS. And I think therein lies a plausible argument for WTO legality, although I won't say that that's of course it's WTO legal risky. Yes, there's no question.
Okay, well, look, I will resist adding. I think Peter has had a few points that were not answered, but I think Alexandra, sorry, I think you're no, go ahead. I was going to go to Kimmo and Robert Jan, but I don't want to shortchange you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. No, just a quick reaction to the comments by the Commission and Agora on the value chain, and indeed to recognize that between the leaked CBAM proposal and the proposal in July, a lot more product groups were added to the annex. So this really reduced any concerns on shifting carbon leakage down the value chain. And you mentioned, Agora mentioned the increase of 10 to 15% of prices. And we found similar ranges when we looked at some semi-finished aluminum products. Although I think this was considered rather high by the industry. And this will be felt increasingly as scope 2 emissions are covered and free allocation is phased out. So I think it's a good idea to take a detailed look at assessing the risk of carbon leakage at the specific product level and see if and how coverage could be further improved eventually. And one could also look not only at tariff chapters concerning specific materials, but also products that might be in other tariff chapters that might still have a very high content of the covered basic materials.
Okay, you guys have been patient. Kimmo and Robert Jan, then. Introduce yourselves, guys. I think most people will know you, but nevertheless.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everybody. And indeed, I want to applaud ERSCST for organizing these debates, because this is really what is needed. I mean, without this kind of debate, we will really lose our compass. My name is Kimmo Järvinen. I work for the Finnish Steel and Metal Producers here in Helsinki, and I've been following most of these debates. And as said, they are valuable addition to the work that we are doing in EU. I want to bring up only one side of the CBAM development. There are many others, and today many of you have correctly pointed out the carbon leakage and other issues. But I want to bring up one thing that specifically in Finland and Sweden and smaller EU nations is worrying, and that is the significant increase in central control on all of the development and technology choices. And as we all agree, I think as we all agree that the CBAM needs something additional along its side to be really functional in terms of doing its job in promoting the climate change mitigation all over the world. I think most of us agree on this one. Then we are proposing different kind of things, CCFD and others, which are great tools. But I want to point out the fact that all of these other tools are governmental, centrally controlled, member state controlled tools. So there is no technology neutrality. There is no competition when you decide to whom you grant these support that is granted. Whereas in the ETS, originally the design was really to initiate, incentivize the industry, the industrial players to compete, to be more low carbon or environmentally friendly. And there was I think there was a functioning system. I think the things that are happening right now in steel industry specifically, where they are developing the world-class new technologies, it really shows that the ETS is working and is incentivizing. So I'm still of the opinion, and with all this due respect to the Commission's analysis, I'm still of the opinion that the free allowances and compensation are by far the most equal and most significant, most efficient ways of doing this. And I don't see the rationale in saying that they're WTO, not WTO compatible, because there is no, to my understanding, there is no predecessor. There are no previous cases in WTO on this one. So I think we are basing our analysis and our estimates on something that doesn't really exist yet. Of course, we have to test it. We are the ones who will be testing it, and that is very important that we test it and debate with Canada and with the US and others. That is exactly what we should be doing, and we are doing it. And COP26 we were doing it. So I think we are on the right track, but let's not lose our sight on what is already existing and then jump into something that is really, I don't want to say the country to whom I'm referring to, but centrally controlled systems. This is what I'm a little bit afraid. And if it's only the member states who are able to grant the CCFDs, then we are really messing up with the EU internal markets. Then we are creating a system where suddenly there is no coherence between the EU member countries. The ones who have more money to put on the game, they are the ones who will become the technology leaders. And even if there would be a technological great innovations, if the country doesn't have the money to support it, we lose it. This is, Andrew, my comment, and I thank you once more very much of this opportunity and the debates. They are very valuable. Thank you.
You know, I'll tell you what, Akimo, I thought I was a party of one. Now I'm happy to hear that I'm a party of two. If you ever look for a job in Brussels, let me know. Robert, yeah, it is, man, it's 2 days before, before Christmas vacation. So, I mean, I can say anything I want. Go ahead, Robert Jan. But unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Arbor Jekyll with ArcelorMittal Steel Industry also. So obviously fully agree with Kimmo. But thanks everybody for raising this to a new level. This is extremely important indeed. So to get it out of the context and get more context on how do we deal with that. And it is very difficult. Very concrete question on the cost absorption. I think it's for Aaron and Michael. I think it was said that this is a dumping issue, has to be solved by trade policy. It is already included in trade policy, and with that they will adapt the actual dumping margin higher. So would you then you also see in the proposal of the Commission that there's a markup unidentified? Would you then maybe translate this into a higher markup than the levy would otherwise be? Or would you do that for firms which do are risk for absorption, which we know. By the way, we doubt that you can solve this with trade policy, but maybe you could do it in this way to solve it, or solve it, probably not solve it, but deal with it in this way that you indeed include this in the markup. Question one. Secondly is the issue what you mentioned on whether if exported European volumes, I talk now for steel, of course, only, are being replaced on the export markets by foreign ones, and that would be an environmental problem. That is a discussion, but if these exported volumes from Europe are to Europe back and not any longer produced, then it's simple, because Europe has a cap. Whether you're more efficient or not doesn't matter. You're out, and the cap will stay there, so the global emissions will go up. This brings me to my issue on exports and volumes. And if there's, it's not the CBAM who causes this problem, of course, is the lack of and decrease of free location. And because of that, the cost will go up. Europe, in our case, steel prices will go up. And if you're not sticky exports, if you're producing a commodity, you will be out of the market. And that is already, you've seen McKinsey charge of that. That is not so difficult to see. The question is how much volumes are we talking about? So Oliver, you mentioned that this will not be a big distortion. I'm not sure if you distort, maybe I misunderstood that, but I'm not sure if it's about steel or cement, maybe other sector. But for us, it's a really big issue, and not only for the export related, because what happens if the steel price goes up, then these export related volumes will have to come back, because you're basically out of the international market. You cannot compete. And the question is, can you then produce these in Europe? At the same time, because the price in Europe goes up, there may be more international players who at that higher price can enter, and maybe, for instance, based on EFs in our steel case, may not pay CBAM, for instance. So that volume and that market dynamism, Michael and Aaron, I really would like if you maybe could see how that would develop and take it into maybe the next version of this, because that I missed a bit here. What we see is that the dynamics of that is pretty clear. The volumes are not. The dynamics will be as follows: that these volumes which come back, there will be another volumes coming in. There will be a frenzy of competition in the European market because of the higher price. Price will likely be set, we don't know for sure, by the, let's say, carbon cost intensive European producer, so rather high. And it would mean that part of European production which cannot come back would have to be closed. We don't know how much. As such, you say, okay, that's fine, but this will also have an impact on the actual cost efficiency of steel producers. We try to run as much higher capacity as you want, because you need to run full because of your high stable costs. So it's not only, the picture is not only by exports alone, and that would mean not take out of some capacity. We don't know how much, because that is depending on the design, the market dynamics, etc. But what we do see is that we had this in the crisis in 2018, to crisis 2020, when capacity had to go out. Then you see when it was a down cycle, when the cycle goes up, capacity goes back, not everything, but goes back, and you go to a high cycle like we have now. What we do see with that dynamism is that it's not a cycle anymore. It's a structural competitive problem for European industry. And particularly Aaron and Michael, or maybe Oliver, I don't know, because you talked a bit, maybe you can see how you see that, and maybe develop actually this market development or distortion in a report like that on the impacts to make it full. Because that I missed a bit, but for the rest, I think it's really, I think all aspects are really dealt with. So thanks.
Yeah, the one thing that what strikes me is this issue of absorption and resource shuffling. And for the last couple of days, I've heard from a couple of people saying, come on, guys, get off it. This is all theoretical. I mean, it's not the first time I hear, but the industry seems to be very preoccupied with it, and I'm not blaming you in any way. If I were in your shoes, I would do exactly the same. But nevertheless, I'm hearing from people that are kind of in the regulatory business, kind of saying that, well, this is a theoretical thing. So it's somebody's got it wrong. Is somebody either exaggerating or somebody's not getting it? And it's not. I'm not saying that in a bad way. I mean, we all learn things in life. So I think it's an interesting thing because obviously it doesn't resonate in certain places, and other people are very, very concerned. There is one more person that has joined and wanted to raise something before I go to further answer. Tom Henry.
Hello, I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah, if you want to introduce yourself briefly, please.
Yeah, so my name is Tom Henry Taupon. I'm still studying economics, basically. And I've been following EICST mainly on Cbam, on the Cbam topic, just out of personal interest, and learned a lot from your paper, so thanks for that. I have a follow-up question on a statement Peter made earlier in the webinar, and please correct me if I understood it wrong, but I definitely understood it that Cbam, in your opinion, is more of a let's say competitive addressing mechanism for EU industries, and not the most efficient way to address climate change and carbon leakage. But and you basically propose that if the EU would be really about cutting net emissions, they should have come up with a plan to drastically invest in third countries and LDCs in climate adaptation and R&D, etc. And I was just wondering whether you could maybe elaborate a little bit on how you think that just investing without or how this would create the right incentives to push countries with low climate ambitions for the action needed in order to achieve emission reductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I think that we've got exactly 30 minutes, and there's a lot of people. Look, I always hate this stuff. Say, well, it's very interesting and a lot of things to discuss, but time is running out. This is like a horrible thing to do. Marcos, do you want to come back on some of this stuff? I'm because again, you raised this issue, which is it may become a bigger issue in the debate as we move on. This absorption and resource shuffling, it will become a bigger thing. I think it's one of the things that is sticking its head above the parapet. How do you guys feel about this? I mean, I sense that you had real serious questions about how urgent or how dramatic is this? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No, it's I think as I said in my first intervention, as you are mentioning now, I think it's something that is identified within the community that is discussing Cbam. I was not going to say within the Commission. We have been discussing this for a couple of years, but it's something that is identified as something that can reduce the effectiveness of the Cbam that we might implement. On the other hand, I think that the feeling that I can have, at least personally or within the discussions that I have had, is that probably something that is inherent to the system that we are designing and we are putting in place. And the moment that we took the decision of going to as a first option for the real embedded emissions in the products we are importing, then the issue of resource shuffling is very difficult to solve within the legal framework that we have. That would be my reply. And then, if I can simply very quickly to something Kimo said regarding the basically state controlled development. The only thing I can say, because you said no competition, that resonated on me, because I've been working in Clima for years, but before I did a couple of years on state aid, energy and environment in DG competition. He asked to be clear that innovation fund, that we have CCFDs, anything that member states might put from their side if they have the budget and the will of doing so, that will be subject to state aid rules, which means that in principle projects are to be selected based on an open call for projects, and that is subject to state aid control and competition shall be ensured in principle. So it's not that we are so dirigist as for avoiding competition in the internal market.
Thank you, Marcus. I don't know, anyone else wants to react to? I think Robert Jan, you had a very long and I'm not saying that negatively, but quite passionate plea about the issue. Aaron, Michael, again, I don't want to start answering for the panelists. I may be tempted in the end, but go ahead if any of you want to react.
I'll jump in, and then you can jump in and correct my interpretation after. That's how we roll as a team anyway. So to respond to Robert, Robert raises some really interesting points. And on the first, on the question of dumping and trade remedy to deal with cost absorption, it's clearly not going to be the cause for, I can't see that aspect of trade remedy law being used specifically and only to deal with dumping that happens because of cost absorption, because of the CBAM and the ETS. But as he says, it could be an increase, it could contribute to existing investigations by adding an increased margin. I think that's, and I think that's likely and desirable, frankly. And I want to amplify what Robert laid out quite clearly and cogently, that the loss of export markets by export-oriented sectors covered under a potential CBAM is not just a question of what, losing 13% or 20% or whatever the percentage would be, depending on the sector of sales. It actually, it threatens the viability of the domestic market share for many of those producers, and not just because of the quirks that Michael referred to in the fuels sector, refined fuel sector, but because of the fundamental market dynamics involved in bringing all that production back to the EU, dealing with cyclical demand in those sectors. So I think Robert laid it out very well, the challenges there. What this is, one of the limitations of the existing paper is we're just looking at instruments outside of the CBAM to try to take account of problems like the loss of export markets. I think Michael and Andre both noted that our future work in this area is going to involve a deep dive into some of the most pressing issues, the first of which will be exports. So watch for this in the new year when we turn our attention to how to deal with this question, which by revealed preference, we see as one of the biggest challenges in the CBAM.
You see, Robert, it's before Christmas, we promised anything. I mean, we promised a solution to export. We can promise anything. We'll see. We'll figure. Tomorrow's another day.
I didn't say a solution.
Scarlett O'Hara said tomorrow's another day, so we adopted that as the ERCST motto. But let me go. Listen, let's go around and go to Oliver and Karsten and Peter, because I think we're getting close to the end and would like to get the opportunity to people to react to these things.
Yeah, no, so just very quickly on resource shuffling. So I agree with Marcus's comment that once the system goes for actually embedded emissions, resource shuffling there is an incentive in some cases for resource shuffling to occur. But I think that in practice, the concern I think is not so much the existence of resource shuffling, so the fact that importers would reduce their charge on the CBAM. I think it's more that for like an aluminium smelter in Europe, that they would face indirect costs that the importer wouldn't face because of the structure of the EU's power market that they can't control, and therefore that they would lose competitiveness and maybe shut down because of that. So when I talk about resource shuffling, the thing that concerns me is not resource shuffling per se, it's the competitiveness loss linked to this phenomenon. But if that's the issue, then I think what we would suggest is, look, the indirect cost in the EU power market will decline over time, right? As we decarbonize the power market, the Commission's impact assessment already says by 2030 we're like under 100 grams per kilowatt hour. Some markets like Iceland, Norway, etc., are already below. France are already well below that. So from that perspective, we would suggest, look, if you were to wait to introduce indirect emissions, it might be less of a competitiveness distortion over time. The second thing I would say is, I think you mentioned that we couldn't just put the charge on average or calculate based on average indirect emissions in a foreign power market because of discrimination. That's true, but I wonder whether we couldn't actually do the average of price setting units in a foreign market. So, for example, any grid operator that should in general have information on the capacity factors of the plant from the previous years that produced power in its power market, in which case in principle it's possible to work out what share of marginal price setting generation, the marginally priced system was from gas, from coal, etc. In which case it should be possible to actually work out, well, who was the marginal generator in that power market on average during the previous year, in which case one could in principle apply the exact same indirect cost charge to importers as actually applies in the EU system. For markets not based on marginal pricing, one could use the average, but it would effectively be the same logic. I think it would work out the same. So I'm actually not convinced that there isn't a solution here, to be honest with you, at least to the carbon leakage problem of resource shuffling.
Let me go to Carsten and then Peter.
I think I would really like to echo Michael's point in terms of what the CBAM discussions in Europe might have contributed to internationally. I think we'll get to judge in 10 years' time, but there might have been very good contributions to this. But I think now we've also got the COP outcome of strong commitments of most of the major economies, 80 to 90% of emissions, GDP, and so on globally, going to climate neutrality. And I think now it's really about making the next steps. And I think these are more in terms of supporting emerging economies, developing countries in realizing the ambitions that they've committed to. And that kind of support, I think, is far easier to structure in terms of public finance, not least because we then can support, for example, the decarbonization of the Indian industry for domestic use of the materials, rather than supporting an export-oriented industry in another country to compete with our European industry. So I think that's also where post-COP, I think we're in a slightly different situation now than pre-COP in terms of what are the objectives. And if we really focus on European approaches, I think then we can, for example, Oliver, tackle the issues relating to indirect emissions if we apply a climate contribution, which can use a default value in a robust manner, and therefore doesn't need to kind of differentiate where things are coming from. We do the international part with dedicated international instruments. I think that is, for me, really the part of the discussion I would like to put on my Christmas wish list, to think how we work together with our trade partners and emerging economies to support them on realizing the ambition they have committed to in Glasgow. And I think there are a set of instruments on the table. Climate alliances, breakthrough alliances have been brought forward in many dimensions with many countries. And I think using these mechanisms, I think, leaves us then to kind of design the European pricing system to do something this decade already. Because what I was very worried about in all the discussion and the mentions here was this terminology buying time. If we buy time, it means we are just delaying, because we currently, in the last decade, we didn't see any action in the basic materials sector. Sorry, Robert, but there was a bit of announcements, but not really anything much happening on the ground. And that was, I think, a strong sign of what ETS as it currently stands can struggle to deliver, and why we need a reform that makes this carbon price effective along the value chain and makes this carbon price effective for investments and gives the resources at the European scale or European-wide such that Kimo's challenge is also addressed, that we can move to climate neutral processes, not only in Sweden, Germany, Netherlands, and France. And I think that is somehow the challenge. We have to make this proposal fit for our Fit for 55 package. And I feel a proposal that currently still talks about buying time is not really in here. But I stop and wish everyone a good Christmas.
I think, Carsten, you must be long EUAs. I think you must be long EUAs for Christmas, because if 100 is not enough for you in this time frame, you must be long EUAs somewhere. So I don't know if Santa's going to bring you anything more.
to correct, I'm saying if we have an effective carbon price on materials, then we get substitution effects, we get material efficiency, we get recycling, and then we get a stronger response to the carbon price increases, which means we wouldn't have the carbon price right now. So a way of mitigating the carbon price is to make, in this decade, the carbon price effective for the value chain and allow everyone to respond to it.
Then I short the market. Peter.
Look, I'll be very quick. I think the key here is Karsten's absolutely right. What is our problem? Our problem is, number one, it's the greenhouse gas emissions, it's climate warming, and it's what Europe is doing to it. You have the Fit for 55 is really ambitious. It's going to have a lot of impacts, and the carbon border adjustment is brought in there to help with the domestic acceptability of very tough measures that the Commission is doing. But the Commission knows that it needs other countries. Both we as a whole need other countries to be on board and coming with us if we're going to address the problem, which is the global warming. And for you, as you guys highlight in this report, the answer is not carbon border adjustment, the answer is convergence. You know, where everyone is pulling and is pulling hard. You can't expect, and I don't think anyone here does expect, that India is going to do exactly what Europe does. There's no reason that it should. The United States is not going to do what Europe does. And there has to be an attempt to think of how do we bring people along with us. My point about the production process methods issue is that if you don't bring people along with you, they will challenge you. You probably will lose in the WTO, not just because of the PPM. It's a question about whether or not you're doing products or, well, anyway, that's, as Aaron said, we'll have the discussion about the WTO compatibility later, but you don't want to have that fight. And the real problem is not the WTO, the real problem is in Paris. If you don't want people in the Paris Agreement and COP, the UNFCCC, to be opposing you because they feel like they're being screwed. And that's why I think the Commission tried very hard to put this as just an environmental thing, not as competitiveness thing. And I think that that's important, and we have to be working toward that. I'm going to stop there. There are a couple of other things I've told Tom Henry separately that, you know, I'd like to give some more response to some of his detailed points. We can do that offline. But I think that this has been really good, and I really appreciate the paper and the discussion that you guys have generated.
Well, look, I will stop here. I think Michael and Aaron, and Alexandra, I think that you guys are going to have to keep your peace until the new year on this. But please remember, all of you, that we are starting phase 3. Things that we will be studying are easy things, such as dealing with externality, with exports and resource shuffling, and level of, how do you compare levels of effort? And what was the fourth one, Michael? Because my memory is failing me at this point.
Indirect, of course.
And indirect cost. I mean, that's trivial things like this that we think that we are super smart and qualified that we can come up with. I think Aaron will say we will not come up with solutions, but we presumably will give it some thought and try and come up with something interesting to say. But first of all, thank you all, and Marcos and Oliver and Peter and Karsten, also to Robert Jan and the others that have raised questions. My colleagues, Michael and Alexandra and Aaron, that it's been so much fun working on these papers for 2021. It's going to be more fun working for 2022. We look forward to being a loyal, I wouldn't call it a loyal opposition, but being a loyal think place for these kind of discussions. And hopefully never have to say that it's very interesting, but we're running out of time. So with this, wishing you all very happy holidays and a happy new year, and hope to see you all in the new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care all.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
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 Bye.